The microphone felt heavy and cold in my hand as 400 guests stared at me. I stood in the center of the grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel, surrounded by towering floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and the judgmental whispers of elite families. Victor Albright, my daughter's new father-in-law, stood next to the five-tier wedding cake with a smirk on his face. He had just taken the stage to toast the newlyweds, but instead of offering blessings, he chose to humiliate me. He called me a penniless single mother who had crawled out of the slums to feast on the scraps of a wealthy family's table. My daughter Olivia was weeping in her white lace gown, her shoulders shaking. Her new husband Nathan looked frozen, caught between his father's commanding presence and his bride's tears. I looked directly into Victor's cold eyes, raised the microphone, and asked a simple question that silenced the room. "Do you really think you can erase the past, Victor?" His smug expression faltered, and in that silent ballroom, I knew the secret he had buried for 25 years was finally clawing its way back to the light. My name is Clara Vance. For 25 years, I was known only as the quiet widow of Maple Street, a woman who scrubbed office floors and counted every penny to raise her daughter. People did not know my history. They did not know the dreams I abandoned or the silent grief that slept in my chest every single night. I raised Olivia alone in a small drafty house in Columbus, Ohio. The monthly rent was $450, and there were winters when I could not afford to turn on the heater. We huddled together under 3 layers of blankets, sharing a single mug of hot tea. I worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, from 6 Plaxon until 14, I was a nursing assistant at the St. Jude Care Center, earning $12 per hour. My duties involved helping elderly patients wash, eat, and manage their daily medications. I cared for residents like Mrs. Mabel, who could not remember her own children, and Mr. Henderson, a veteran who told the same war stories every day. I learned patience there, and I learned how to hide my own pain. After my nursing shift ended, I had a 1-hour break to grab a cheap sandwich before starting my night job at 15:30. I worked as a night custodian cleaning the corporate offices of the wealthy in downtown Columbus, washing floors and emptying trash bins until 22:30. I spent hours scrubbing mahogany desks and emptying trash bins filled with corporate documents that looked more expensive than my worn-out shoes. I was always tired, my shoulders aching, and my feet bleeding inside my cheap retail sneakers. But when I walked through the door of our little house, I always washed my face, put on a warm smile, and sat down at the kitchen table with Olivia. Olivia was my entire world. When she was only 6 years old, she would sit on our worn-out sofa, watching me mend her school clothes. She would look at my calloused hands and say, "When I grow up, Mama, I will buy you a house with 10 rooms and a kitchen that does not squeak." I would laugh, hold her close, and tell her that we were already rich because we had each other. We survived on love, cheap meals, and small moments of happiness. We celebrated her high school graduation with a single cupcake and a match, sitting on the porch as the sun went down. When she got accepted in a nursing school, we cried together, knowing that the years of skipping meals and working double shifts had finally paid off. But as Olivia grew, she started asking questions about her father, Henry Vance. I always gave her the same gentle lie. "He had to leave us before you were born, sweetheart. He went away and he could not come back." It was the story I had been forced to tell, a story written in fear and sealed with a typed letter I received 25 years ago. I did not want her to carry the heavy stones of betrayal and shame that I carried in my heart. Then, Olivia went to college and met Nathan Albright. Nathan was not like the arrogant, wealthy boys I often cleaned up after. He was quiet, polite, and worked part-time at a local shelter. When he first came to our modest house, he brought me a small bunch of wild daisy flowers. He did not look down on our cracked linoleum floor or our mismatched plates. He helped me wash the dinner dishes and listened to Olivia talk about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. I saw the way he looked at my daughter with a gentle respect that made me believe he was different. After 2 years of dating, Nathan proposed. Olivia was glowing when she showed me the modest ring. But my heart froze when she told me his father's name, Victor Albright, the CEO of Albright Health Group. I tried to hide my panic. I told myself that Victor was a powerful man now, and surely he would not remember a young clerk from 25 years ago. I agreed to meet the Albright family at a private dinner. Evelyn Albright, Victor's wife, had arranged it at an expensive restaurant where a single steak cost $120. I wore my only decent blue dress, which I had ironed 3 times. When we arrived, Victor was already seated. He was 55 years old, with sharp gray eyes and a tailored suit. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes narrowed. For a brief second, I saw terror in his face. Then his mask returned. He greeted me with a cold, formal handshake. During the dinner, he asked about my work, smiling condescendingly when I mentioned my cleaning jobs. "It takes a certain kind of person to do manual labor," Victor said, swirling his expensive red wine. "But I suppose some families are simply accustomed to a lower standard of living. My son is marrying into a very different background than what he is used to." Nathan looked embarrassed, and Olivia gripped my hand under the table. I remained silent, swallowing the burning anger in my throat. I told myself I would endure anything for my daughter's happiness. But Victor did not want peace. He wanted to make sure I knew my place, and he was willing to destroy my dignity to keep his secrets safe. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a nightmare of preparations. Victor insisted on a massive celebration with 400 guests, turning what Olivia wanted to be a simple garden ceremony into a public display of the Albright family's wealth. He paid for the luxury hotel ballroom, the expensive catering, and the famous orchestra. I could not contribute much financially, but I spent 3 weeks hand-sewing tiny pearls onto Olivia's wedding veil under the dim light of my kitchen. One evening, Olivia came to visit and found me sitting with a needle and thread, my eyes aching from the strain. She sat beside me, her eyes filling with tears. "Mama, you do not have to do this," she whispered. "Victor keeps making comments about how our family is not contributing. I feel like he is trying to buy my love and erase you." I wiped her tears and said, "A father-in-law can buy flowers and food, Olivia, but he cannot buy the love I put into this veil. This is from me to you, and nobody can take that away." Victor and Evelyn spared no expense to make the wedding a grand spectacle. Evelyn selected rare white roses that had to be flown in from Ecuador, costing over $15,000 for the centerpieces alone. Victor hired a renowned wedding planner and insisted on selecting the most expensive menu, featuring caviar and filet mignon. Whenever I tried to offer suggestions, Victor would dismiss me with a wave of his hand, saying, "Let the professionals handle this, Clara. We want our guests to experience a true high society event, not a neighborhood potluck." I had to watch my daughter get caught in the middle of their demands, trying to keep the peace while feeling her own wishes crushed under the weight of their money. As I sewed, my mind drifted back to the dark truth I had hidden for 25 years. I was 27 years old, happily married to Henry, and 5 months pregnant with Olivia. Henry was a kind, hard-working delivery coordinator at Hudson Medical Supply, where I worked as a billing clerk. We were a young couple trying to build a life in our small apartment. But our lives were shattered when I discovered that Victor, who was then the financial director, was embezzling money. I found records showing he had stolen $1,500 Zerozone from a children's charity clinic fund, redirecting the money into a shell company called Albright Care Partners. When I showed the records to Henry, he was furious. The clinic helped low-income families get medical equipment, and Victor was stealing from the most vulnerable. We decided to report the theft to the company's owner. But Victor was ahead of us. He used blank forms I had signed weeks earlier for routine office inventory updates, forging my signature on financial transfers to make it look like Henry and I were the embezzlers. He cornered us in his office, showing us the forged documents. "If you breathe a word of this to the police," Victor had whispered, his voice dripping with venom, "I will ensure you both spend 10 years in federal prison. Your baby will be born behind bars, Clara. Think about your unborn child." We were young, terrified, and had no money for lawyers. The next day, Henry was suspended and I was fired. Henry refused to let Victor ruin our lives. He told me he was going to meet Walter Cross, a record clerk who had access to the original unforged files. "I will clear our names, Clara," Henry told me, kissing my forehead. He left our apartment that rainy evening, carrying a folder of notes. He never returned. 3 days later, a typed letter arrived at our door. It was cold and brief, stating that he could not handle the pressure of the impending criminal charges and had decided to leave the country. I spent months searching for him, calling every hospital and police department in Ohio. But there was no trace of Henry Vance. I was left alone, pregnant, and carrying the shame of a crime we did not commit. Victor went on to build Albright Health Group using the stolen $1,500,000 as his starting capital, transforming himself into a respected local philanthropist. Meanwhile, I lived in poverty, hiding from the world to protect Olivia from the scandal. I never told Olivia the truth because I did not want her to grow up hating the father she never knew or fearing the powerful man who had destroyed our family. But now, 25 years later, my daughter was marrying Victor's son. I had promised myself I would stay quiet during the wedding. I had resolved to swallow my pride, wear my cheap blue dress, and smile as Olivia walked down the aisle. But as I stood in the ballroom, listening to Victor's cruel toast, I realized that some monsters do not deserve silence. I watched the guests sipping their expensive champagne, chatting about their luxury cars and stock options. They had no idea that the foundation of the Albright wealth was built on the suffering of sick children and the destruction of a young family. The memories of my nights cleaning office floors while my feet throbbed, the times I had to choose between buying fresh milk or paying the electricity bill, all came rushing back to me. For 25 years, I had carried the burden of Victor's crimes. I had let him walk away with the money, the power, and the respect of the community. I had allowed myself to be treated as a nobody, a ghost in the corners of their wealthy world. But seeing the tears on my daughter's face, the same daughter who had sat on our squeaky kitchen floor and promised to take care of me, broke the last chain of my fear. I knew that if I did not stand up now, Victor would continue to control our lives. The truth was a fire that had been smoldering inside me for 25 years, and it was finally time to let it burn. The wedding ceremony itself had been beautiful. When Olivia walked down the aisle, her hand trembling against Nathan's arm, she looked like an angel. The hand-sewn veil trailed behind her, catching the golden light of the chandeliers. I wept silent tears of joy from the front row, forcing myself to ignore Victor's smug face across the aisle. For a brief hour, I believed we might actually get through the day without a disaster, but my hopes were shattered during the reception dinner. After the first dance, Victor took the microphone and walked to the center of the stage. The 400 guests quieted down, expecting a heartwarming speech. Instead, Victor turned his gaze to me. "We must acknowledge Olivia's mother, Clara Vance," Victor said, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art speakers. "She raised Olivia in a small rented house, working cleaning jobs to get by. It must be quite a shock for her to stand in a room like this. I suppose we should admire how some people can manage to marry their children into wealth they could never dream of earning. We are happy to welcome Olivia, but we must make it clear that the Albright family is not a charity for those who failed to secure their own futures." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Olivia gasped. Her hands flying to her mouth, tears spilled down her cheeks. Nathan stood up, his face red with anger. "Dad, that is enough," he shouted, but Victor merely waved him off with a patronizing smile. I felt a cold anger wash over me, replacing the fear that had held me prisoner for 25 years. I stood up from my chair, my wooden heels clicking against the marble floor. I walked up to the stage, took the microphone directly from Victor's hand, and looked him dead in the eye. "Do you really think you can erase the past, Victor?" I asked, my voice steady and clear. "You call me a charity case, but you should tell these 400 guests how you built your empire. You should tell them about the $100, zeros you stole from a children's clinic 25 years ago." Victor's face drained of color, his fingers clenching into fists. "Clara, you are hysterical," he hissed, trying to grab the microphone back. "Security, escort this woman out." But before the security guards could move, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. A man in a sharp charcoal suit walked into the room, flanked by Detective Elena Cruz and another uniform officer. The man walked with a slight limp, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and intensely familiar. My breath caught in my throat, and the microphone nearly slipped from my fingers. It was Henry. My husband, whom I had mourned and searched for over 25 years, was standing at the entrance of the ballroom. Olivia stared at the man, her eyes wide. Nathan looked confused, but Victor looked absolutely terrified, his knees visibly trembling. Henry walked slowly toward the stage, his eyes fixed entirely on me, filled with a deep, silent emotion. He then turned to face Victor. "The security guards will not be touching my wife, Victor," Henry said, his voice carrying a calm authority that shook the entire room. "And you will not be lying to our daughter anymore." The guests were completely frozen, their eyes moving back and forth between Henry and Victor. The orchestra had stopped playing, and the waiters stood still in the doorways. The silence was so absolute that you could hear the soft rustling of Olivia's silk gown as she took a step forward. Henry walked up the steps of the stage, his gaze never leaving Victor. With every step he took, Victor seemed to shrink. The powerful billionaire, who had just insulted me in front of 400 people, now looked like a cornered animal. Henry stood right next to me, and for the first time in 25 years, I smelled the familiar scent of cedar wood and rain that had always belonged to him. He looked at me, his eyes shining with tears, and gave a small nod that told me everything. He was real. He was alive. He had come back to finish the fight we had started 25 years ago. I reached out and touched his sleeve, just to make sure I was not dreaming. His coat was solid under my fingers. The nightmare of my 25 years of loneliness was finally breaking, and the truth was about to be told. The guests began to whisper frantically, the sound like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Some of Victor's business partners stood up, demanding to know what was going on, while Evelyn sat frozen at the head table, her face pale as she stared at the man she had believed was long gone. Victor took a step back, his hand shaking as he pointed at Henry. "This is a setup," Victor muttered, his voice barely audible over the microphone. "This man is a fraud. Henry Vance disappeared decades ago. He was a thief who ran away from his responsibilities." Henry simply smiled, a cold, calm expression that held no fear. "I did not run, Victor," Henry said. "You had me taken. You locked me away in a place where you thought my voice would never be heard again. But a lie only lasts until the truth arrives, and tonight, your time is up." I looked at Olivia, whose hands were trembling so much that her wedding bouquet dropped to the floor, the white roses scattering at her feet. She looked from Henry to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama, is that really him?" I could only nod as the tears choked my throat. "Yes, baby, that is your father. He never left us." The shock in the room was palpable. The 400 guests, who had just been participating in a grand social event, were now witnesses to the unfolding of a decades-old crime. The luxury decorations, the gold leaf cake, the expensive champagne. All of it felt cheap and hollow in the presence of this raw, sudden truth. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers as Henry stepped onto the stage. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Henry reached out and took my hand. His skin was warm and real. The tears I had held back for decades finally spilled over. "Henry," I whispered, unable to believe he was standing beside me. He looked at me with a tenderness that healed a piece of my broken soul. "I am here, Clara. I am so sorry it took me 25 years to get back to you," he said softly. He then turned to Olivia, who was trembling, clutching Nathan's arm. "Olivia, my beautiful girl, I am your father, Henry Vance, and I did not abandon you." Henry turned his gaze to the stunned crowd and the trembling Victor. "25 years ago, I was framed for a crime I did not commit," Henry announced, his voice steady. "Victor Albright forged my wife's signature on corporate transfer documents at Hudson Medical Supply to hide his own embezzlement of $1,900,000. When I went to meet a record clerk named Walter Cross to retrieve the original documents, Victor's hired driver, Simon Ward, intercepted me. They beat me, took the files, and locked me away in a private asylum outside Columbus under the false name Edward Cole. For 23 years I was held captive, kept under heavy sedation so I could not remember my own name or my family. They paid the facility $120,000 a year using a shell charity account to keep me hidden forever. The administrators were paid off to keep me in a chemically induced state of confusion, ensuring I could never escape or seek help. I was just a ghost in a white room, drugged into forgetting the wife and baby I loved. The asylum was a dark, quiet place with high brick walls and barred windows. The daily routine was designed to erode a person's sense of self. Every morning, a nurse would bring a tray of small white pills that made my mind feel like it was wrapped in a thick fog. If I tried to ask questions or demand to see my family, they would increase the dosage, leaving me asleep for days. But in the quietest hours of the night, when the drugs began to wear off slightly, I would look at the ceiling and whisper two names over and over, Clara and Olivia. They were my anchor, the only thread connecting me to a life that felt like a distant dream. I survived on those names for 23 years, refusing to let the darkness swallow them completely. A collective gasp rippled through the 400 guests. Nathan looked at his father in absolute horror. "Dad, is this true?" Nathan whispered, his voice cracking. Victor tried to regain his composure, his face twisting into a mask of rage. "This is a ridiculous fabrication. This man is an imposter, a lunatic. You have no proof of these absurd claims." "Actually, we do," Detective Elena Cruz said, stepping forward onto the stage. She opened a manila folder, pulling out a stack of certified documents. "We have the original ledgers from Hudson Medical Supply, which were recovered from a hidden safe. Under California Penal Code Section 470, the forgery of Clara Vance's signature on the liability transfer documents has been forensically proven because the signature was forged, the agreements are legally declared void ab initio, meaning they were void from the very beginning. The statute of limitations for the fraud did not begin until the forgery was officially discovered, which makes Victor Albright fully liable for the original $1,500,000 embezzlement and the subsequent cover-up." Henry continued, his eyes locked on Victor. 2 years ago, the sedation was reduced due to a change in the facility's medical staff, and my memories began to return. I managed to escape the asylum on a rainy night, climbing through a basement window and walking 5 miles to the highway. But I knew that if I came back to Clara immediately without proof, Victor would use his wealth and high-priced lawyers to crush us again. So, I took a job as a night janitor at Albright Health Group under my alias Edward Cole. For 2 years, I worked in the shadows of Victor's own headquarters, cleaning his office while searching for the evidence of his crimes. With the help of Owen Miller, a retired accountant who had kept copies of the original files out of guilt, I finally found the key to Victor's private safe. Inside, we found the original forged documents, the records of the secret payments to the asylum, and the typed letter Victor had forced his driver to send to Clara 25 years ago to make her believe I had abandoned her. I spent 24 months mopping the floors of the very man who stole my life, biding my time until I had everything we needed to bring him down. During those long night shifts, the office building was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. I spent hours sweeping and polishing, looking at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I knew that my family was just a few miles away, living in the house on Maple Street. It took every ounce of my self-control not to drop my mop and run to them, but I knew that Victor's lawyers were powerful. If I made one mistake, he would destroy us forever. So, I hid in the utility closet, met with Owen Miller in dark parking lots, and studied the digital lock on Victor's safe until I memorized the combination. The wait was long, and the work was hard, but every night of scrubbing was worth it for this single moment of justice. The revelation of Henry's 2 years working as a janitor in Victor's own building sent a shockwave through the room. Victor's eyes darted frantically, looking for a way out. He had walked past Henry 100 times, never recognizing the man whose life he had stolen, dismissing him as just another low-wage worker who cleaned his toilets. The irony was sharp, and it cut Victor to the bone. The evidence was undeniable. Henry had gathered the bank transfer records, the forged signature cards, and the logbooks of the asylum payments. Everything was neatly organized in the folder that Detective Cruz now held. The truth was no longer a secret kept in a dark drawer. It was a public record, and Victor's empire was crumbling in front of the very society he had tried so hard to impress. Victor took a desperate step back, looking around the room for an exit, but the police officers blocked the doors. "This is a conspiracy," Victor shouted, his voice high and panicked. "My wife, my partners, they will destroy you for this." It was then that Evelyn Albright stood up from her seat at the head table. She did not look at her husband with fear anymore. Her face was set in stone. She walked toward the stage, holding her cell phone. "No, Victor. Nobody is going to help you," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am turning over all of my personal records and phone recordings to Detective Cruz. For years, I suspected you were hiding something terrible. You kept making large, unexplained financial transfers from our joint accounts. I recently discovered you spent over $2,700,000 of our marital funds to pay for the confinement of Henry Vance, under the guise of charity donations. Under the law, this is a clear case of dissipation of marital assets. I have already filed for divorce, and I will be clawing back every single dollar you stole from our family to pay for your crimes. Evelyn turned to Detective Cruz and handed her the phone. On this device, there is a recording from 6 months ago where Victor admits to his driver Simon Ward that he was paying off the facility administrators to keep Edward Cole permanently drugged. Because he could never let him speak, he also threatened to make Clara disappear if she ever tried to investigate the old Hudson files. Detective Cruz nodded, taking the phone. Victor Albright, you are under arrest for kidnapping, forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, and elder abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15610-30, for the unlawful chemical restraint and financial exploitation of Henry Vance. Please put your hands behind your back. The guests watched in stunned silence as the metal handcuffs clicked around Victor's wrists. The man who had entered the ballroom as a powerful billionaire was led out in disgrace, his head bowed, flanked by police officers. Olivia ran onto the stage and threw her arms around Henry, weeping uncontrollably. "Dad! Oh my God, Dad!" she sobbed. Henry held her tight, his own tears wetting her wedding veil. "I am so sorry, Olivia. I missed your first steps. Your first day of school, your graduation. But I never stopped dreaming of this day," he whispered. Nathan walked up slowly, his eyes filled with shame. He looked at Olivia, then at Henry. "I am so sorry for what my father did to your family," Nathan said quietly. "If you want me to leave, I understand." Olivia wiped her tears and reached out, taking Nathan's hand. "Nathan, you are not your father. You stood by me, and you helped me find the truth. But we cannot start our marriage on the ruins of a lie. We need to postpone the wedding and rebuild our lives on honest terms." Nathan nodded, hugging her gently. "Whatever you need, Olivia, I will wait for you." Evelyn walked over to me, her eyes filled with regret. "Clara, I cannot apologize enough for my husband's cruelty. I will ensure that the assets reclaimed from the divorce are used to compensate you and Henry for the 25 years of suffering he caused." I looked at her and said, "Thank you, Evelyn, but the only thing that matters to me is that my husband is finally home." The guests began to leave the ballroom quietly, leaving the grand space empty except for our family. The 5-tier wedding cake remained untouched, a silent monument to a false empire that had finally crumbled. The wedding planner and the hotel staff worked in absolute silence, clearing the tables and folding the chairs as if trying to erase the memory of the night. Henry, Olivia, and I walked out of the hotel together, the Hansoon veil draped over Olivia's arm. As we stepped into the warm night air, I looked at Henry, then at our beautiful daughter. For 25 years, I had believed that silence was the only way to survive. But as we drove away from the hotel, leaving the shadows of the Albright family behind, I knew that the truth had finally set us free. Our long night was over and the morning was finally here. We returned to our small house on Maple Street. It was the same house where I had spent so many lonely nights crying, wondering if Henry had really abandoned me. But tonight, the house felt different. It felt warm, and the squeaky kitchen fan sounded like a familiar song. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he touched the wooden surface. "I remembered this table, Clara," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "In the darkest nights at the asylum, when the drugs made me forget my own name, I would picture you sitting here, sewing under the light. That memory was the only thing that kept me alive." I sat beside him, taking his hand, and we wept together. We had lost 25 years of our lives, years that we could never get back. But we had found each other, and we had our daughter. The justice we had won was sweet, but the love that had survived the storm was the greatest victory of all. As the days turned into weeks, Henry slowly began to adjust to a world he had been stolen from. We spent our evenings sitting on the front porch, watching the stars and talking about the future. Olivia and Nathan spent their time helping us, and Nathan worked hard to distance himself from his father's actions. In the following weeks, Henry had to give long, detailed depositions to the state prosecutors, helping them map out the financial trails and the connections of the asylum administrators. The legal battles were long and complex, But with Evelyn's cooperation and the clear evidence we possessed, Victor was sentenced to a long term in prison. For the first time in my life, I felt a deep, lasting peace. The drafty house on Maple Street did not feel so small anymore. It felt like a sanctuary where a family had been broken, tested, and finally made whole.